Thank you, Jimmy. It's a real pleasure and a privilege to speak to this group. I've had a really couple genuinely awesome presentations this morning, so prepare to be underwhelmed. Is this on? Closer, okay. I want to lower the bar so the expectations aren't too high here. But let me first just shout out to Jimmy for really being the crystallizing force for coalescing this group of low-carb advocates. Now, I usually speak about fatty acids and lipids. That's an area of study in my laboratory, and I'm going to leave that to Chris Masterjohn because he's, after all, the lipidologist, right? So he'll speak on that a little bit more. I had too high a GPA. I wanted to be a lipidologist. I had a 4 in high school, except for that typing class. But today I'm going to talk about another topic I unfortunately don't get enough opportunities to discuss, and that's related to issues surrounding exercise while following a low-carbohydrate diet. And trust me, there's probably more mythologies and misconceptions surrounding exercise than anywhere in the clinical literature, and I'll talk a little bit about the history of sort of sports nutrition and the high carbohydrate paradigm to get us rolling here. So my as far as introduction here, some of you may know my colleague Steve Finney, who I'm very, very fortunate to work closely with over the last 5 or 6 or 7 years or so. And we wrote a book called The Art and Science of Low Carbohydrate Living that was published last year. And we made a strong case for the fact that people who are insulin resistant are very suitable for low carbohydrate diets because that manifests itself functionally as a form of carbohydrate intolerance. So these, of course, as you know, are people with type 2 diabetes and metabolic syndrome. Most people who have some form of obesity have a degree of insulin resistance, and that's who we really wrote the book for. But it's really a continuum of insulin resistance. So if we look at the other side of the continuum, the people who are insulin sensitive, those are primarily the athletes and people who are normal weight. So you might ask yourself if low carb works for people with insulin resistance, and of course we have a lot of evidence for that. Is it really necessary or effective for people who don't have insulin resistance? And that's what I want to touch on today. My sort of cliff note answer would be yes, there is a case that can be made, and that's why we really wrote our second book, which was just released a couple months ago, called The Art and Science of Low Carbohydrate Performance. Both books very complementary. The second one much shorter and it targeted really for active individuals, not just the elite athlete, but anybody really interested in following low carb and being active. So briefly, my goal today is to convince you that carbohydrates are not an obligate nutrient in the diet. You've heard already in lectures that carbohydrates are not essential, but there is this belief if you're exercising, you need carbohydrate for fuel. And I will hope to show you that given at least a couple weeks of adaptation to low carbohydrate, you can reduce it from an obligate nutrient to an optional nutrient. And furthermore, show you how this could actually enhance your performance, allow you to train harder, perform longer. And another aspect of exercise is recovery. And there are many reasons why low carbohydrate diets might enhance your ability to recover. Okay, a little history. If you consider that we've been promoting low carbohydrate diets for general health and dietary recommendations for the last 3 or 4 decades, the history of high carbohydrate diets for sport, it really goes back even further. Some of the first evidence that carbohydrates were important go back to the Boston Marathon, where they actually measured blood glucose levels in marathoners after the race and showed in 1924 that they were significantly decreased. And this led some researchers to postulate, well, let's provide carbohydrate to these athletes the following year, and they did so, and it improved their performance. So that was sort of the first inkling that carbohydrates might be important. And you have to remember, back in 1920s, we did not have the understanding we do today about the importance of glycogen and fuel use and muscle and so forth. We were just starting to understand some of the biochemistry. And there wasn't a lot of follow-up work immediately, but in the 30s and 40s, there were pockets of researchers in Scandinavia and other European countries who were looking at higher carbohydrate diets and showing a connection with better performance. But it really wasn't until the late 60s where really Scandinavian researchers were leading the sort of the sports nutrition discipline, and they reintroduced the muscle biopsy technique, where you actually snip a little piece of skeletal muscle out of a person, and you can study glycogen and carbohydrate metabolism. And they did a series of experiments really showing high carbohydrate diets were linked to better performance. Now, of course, the Achilles heel with a lot of this work is that they never put athletes or any of their subjects on a low carbohydrate diet for more than 3 or 4 days, or a week at the longest. So they did not really allow adaptation. So after that, that really started the high carbohydrate paradigm for athletes. There's many researchers over the next several decades that really made their careers studying carbohydrate metabolism during exercise. Ben Saltine, Lawrence Spriet, Dave Kostel, see their photos there. Many others, dozens and dozens of very prominent exercise physiologists and researchers continued to study high carbohydrate diets. And you may have heard of this sports drink. Around this time, Gatorade was developed down at the University of Florida, and the football players, at that time it was originally developed as an electrolyte replacement, but quickly they introduced carbohydrate into these drinks. And you all know this is now a billion-dollar industry, where there's many other sports drinks out there, energy drinks, and almost exclusively they use carbohydrate and simple sugars, maltodextrin, as their source of fuel in these drinks. Now, if you ask yourself, where's the innovation here in the last 30 years, and I would say there really hasn't been much. I mean, we use sucrose, we use glucose, we use fructose, maltodextrin, and this is viewed as the standard in sports nutrition to enhance endurance performance and strength performance as well. So I want to talk to you about what I think are sort of the next milestones, if you will, in this historical evolution of sports nutrition, and talk to you about two things. The first is a new sports drink that I've been involved with called Generation UCAN, and that'll lead me into really the majority of the talk. I want to discuss how we can talk about restricting carbohydrate and its effects on performance in the face of 3 or 4 decades of research that have promoted just the opposite.